Hello again from Shanghai. The Dutch must have been smoking something because the newly appointed Dutch cabinet includes a swath of China hawks. Most importantly, the new trade minister, who is in fact blacklisted in China, which of course begs the question, how on earth is this guy going to do his job? Now, not only are these appointments remarkably stupid, at least in my modest opinion, but also remarkably against the current trend where the European countries now, from trade to defense, are in fact moving away from the United States and now running back to China. And here I think it is important to point out that the Dutch should know better by now because they have indeed a history, even a recent history, of being caught in the middle and being screwed by the United States on the one hand side and at the same time antagonizing China. Now, before we move on, please like the video if you do, of course, and of course, thank you for subscribing to my channel. So, there is indeed a new cabinet, and that follows the elections from last year in October. Now, we're not going to discuss the whole cabinet, the formation or the coalition. That's not important here, but I want to zoom in on three key figures who now shape the China policy. And the first suspect to mention there is Vincent Karamanz. He's the former economic affairs minister, and he's the one who was actually nationalizing Nexperia last year. And Nexperia is the Chinese semiconductor company. We talk about that case a little bit later. Now, he moved to a new department, the Department of Infrastructure and Water Management. And that is, of course, also another strategic infrastructure heavy portfolio department. And as such, will have to deal with China for sure. So not only do they remember him in China very well, but he will have to deal with China also again, of course. The second person here to mention is the new foreign minister, and that obviously is a very important job. And this is a guy called Tom Berendsen. Now, this guy is quite notorious because he took a tough line on China during his time in the European Parliament. He was a member of the European Parliament, and he was criticizing or talking a lot about the Chinese investments in European strategic infrastructure. So this, of course, is also a guy which is very well known in China, and of course now as foreign minister will have to deal with China quite a lot. And here I think we can draw a big parallel with Kaja Kallas, Europe's top diplomat, which of course needs to deal with the Russians some way or another, but at the same time is of course a very big Russophobe. But the biggest problem of all is the new Minister for Foreign Trade and Development, and that is a person called Sjoerd Sjoersma. He is in fact one of the most outspoken China critics in Parliament, a symbolic figure, if you want, for value-based China policy. And the value-based China policy is a kind of a broad European policy towards China, where they would criticize China for human rights and not following the international rules-based order. That is, by the way, the order which has been buried now by the Canadian Prime Minister Carney. But this Sjoerdsma is the one who was heavily criticizing China, not only for human rights, and security issues, which he said, well, these issues are also part of the conversation we need to have with China. He also said that he will not be silent as long as the genocide against the Uyghurs continued in Xinjiang. He also submitted a motion about this genocide. And he also called for a boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing 2022. So it's not surprise, if you know a bit about China, why he has been blacklisted. Now, the fact that he, of all people, will have a say in trade relations is probably the biggest mistake of all. Because after all, he's completely engaged in symbolic politics by putting in this motion in place, which of course is very hopeless. There is no chance it will change anything in China. This guy now is in charge of trade. And of course, he has maneuvered himself over the last years into a very difficult position with his criticism of China. And as a result, he cannot enter the country anymore. And as a matter of fact, at any international meeting or forums, he will most likely be completely ignored by China. So the question here is, of course, then, How on earth can he carry out his function if he even cannot enter China? And the China-Dutch trade is significant because the Netherlands is the second largest trading partner for China in Europe. And the trade volume between two countries is around 110 billion euros. 20 billion from the Netherlands to China, 90 billion from China to the Netherlands. And more critically for the Netherlands, they are heavily dependent on China for 8 critical materials, rare earth minerals. So the Dutch are obviously well aware that alienating China too far will have the risk for them to lose access to its huge market and these critical inputs, as we just mentioned. And here we need to talk about two companies which are in the middle of all this, and this is Nexperia and ASML. The Nexperia case is well documented. And that's the fact that last year in September, the Dutch nationalized Nexperia, a Chinese-owned semiconductor manufacturer. And the reasons they gave was that they thought that some know-how or strategic assets would be relocated to China. Now, the timing, however, suggests other reasons, because there was at that time an impending United States 50% ownership rule, meaning that the United States entity list, and that's a list where they blacklist certain companies, they would actually extend this list to any subsidiary with 50% or more ownership by a blacklisted firm. And Nexperia, who was not blacklisted, would fall on that rule because the mother company, Wingtech, was already on that list. So the Dutch officials feared that if Nexperia would remain completely tied to Wingtech, it indeed could be cut off from United States markets and American technology, and that of course in return would then disrupt the European supply chains. So what do you do then as a good lackey? And of course, the Americans might have whispered in the Dutch ears, well, maybe you should nationalize Nexperia, make it into a Dutch company. And of course, as such, you can avoid it entering the entity list. And that is indeed what the Dutch did. Of course, the Chinese hit back immediately. They suspended sales of the chips, and that then caused havoc in the European automotive industry. Now, the Dutch, of course, expected some backup from the United States. Unfortunately for them, that did not happen because on October 30th, and that is 1 month after the Dutch nationalized Nexperia, Trump and Xi had their bromance in South Korea, and they struck a trade truce for 1 year. And part of the deal was indeed that the Americans would suspend the implementation of that 50% rule for 1 year. So the result of that was that the Dutch were left to hold the bag, incurring the wrath from the Chinese, while the Americans and the Chinese had this 1 year truce. So the result of that was that the Chinese were angry and the Dutch were left to hold the bag and the Americans were off to somewhere else. So consequently, a few weeks later, the Dutch government announced it would halt its intervention in Nexperia, and that, of course, that means effectively reversing this whole emergency takeover that they were trying to do. And then there's the ASML case. Now, ASML is the world's leading supplier of lithography machines, and these are being used to make cutting-edge semiconductors, which of course are very crucial, for instance, for artificial intelligence. And ASML is really at the heart of the conflict between China and the United States for dominance over certain strategic tech sectors. Now, ASML is not a small company. In 2025, they generated around 32 billion euros in total sales, for which China accounted for almost 1/3 of that sales. And that, of course, made China into ASML's largest single market. And because ASML is able to make these very advanced machines, which the Chinese, by the way, cannot yet make, that, of course, urged the Americans to pressure them into restricting exports of these machines to China. So in January 2023, the Netherlands and the United States reached an agreement to restrict the export of these machines. And that agreement would become effective 1 year later in January 2024. And in the meantime, for 1 year, there would be a gentleman's agreement between the United States and the Dutch government to limit the sales to China. Now, however, according to two Bloomberg journalists who wrote a book about this, during that period, that 1 year gentleman's agreement, ASML sold far more chip machines to China than was agreed to the Americans. And when the Americans found out about this, they really were absolutely furious. And now the story becomes even more interesting because, again, to the journalist from Bloomberg who wrote this book, the then Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and of course we know him because now he's the NATO boss, he then went to ASML, to the CEO, a guy called Peter Wessink, and he said to him that he was venturing into dangerous territory and that he felt that the Dutch government, that they were misled and humiliated by ASML in the eyes of its most important ally, and that, of course, is the United States. So that time already, Rutte was actually choosing the side of the Americans over business priorities for ASML. So Rutte already that time showed to be a good lackey of the United States. And to top it off, he also, again, reportedly by these Bloomberg journalists, he also told the CEO of ASML that regaining American trust was both a United States demand and it was also in ASML's own interest. So basically, Rutte was here helping the Americans in pressuring ASML to fall in line. And consequently, the export restrictions came into place, were even tightened over the last 2 years, and the result is that ASML now expects for 2026 that the share of its sales in China would fall from 33% in 2025 to 20% in 2026. So it is clear from the Nexperia experience and the ASML case that the Netherlands really is finding itself right in the middle of this middle power squeeze. Squeezed by China and squeezed by the United States. And both cases illustrate quite clearly how these middle powers could be hurt commercially and politically, while the two giants, United States and China, are actually concluding a deal somewhere else. But in the meantime, ASML is losing billions in revenue in China. Nexperia is still a huge mess, hasn't been solved until this very day, and these are all, of course, huge headaches for the Dutch. Now, knowing this, you would guess or you would think that the newly Dutch cabinet would be pragmatic on both sides, with the Americans and with the Chinese. But no, what now has happened is that the new cabinet in the Netherlands, by appointing these three China hawks, they're actually signaling now to China that trade with China will not longer be treated as politically neutral. But this most likely will undermine the business of the very companies like ASML they're really trying to protect. So, although most Europeans are now trying to balance both sides, the Dutch clearly are going the opposite, and that most likely, well, almost guaranteed, will be a recipe for disaster with China. Okay, thank you for watching, and we see each other next time. Bye bye.